Hello. Right. I thought I'd better do some programming because I think in my last video I said I was gonna um, reprogram something from scratch. It was like a little Minecrafty thing on Unity, and I said I would do it in on a Thursday, which I think was in 2 days' time, and it's now July, August, September, October, November, December. It's 6 months later. So 2 days has become 6 months, in which time I haven't done much programming. So I thought let's just do some programming, and I've forgotten everything. But I had something in mind that's private, but I thought I've got to record something. So what we've got here is a Perlin terrain, 2D, obviously, that you can go along for infinity. You can go as far as you like. Let me stop bubbling around so that you can concentrate. So what I've got is the main player, which is a little bubble, and let me put on the timer so I so I don't go into 3 hours of watching me debug nonsense. Um, I'll describe what I'm going to do in a moment. Anyway, so I've got the main player, which is a bubble, and then you've got PerlinTerrain, as I said, going off left and right. And we've got some clouds, and I've got some sea, and that's about it. Oh, you can switch on by tapping the screen. What I call like crash bubbles. I don't know what I'm going to do with these. At the moment I've just got them on so you don't crash into the floor. That's the only mechanic. Now, what I was just after was creating some kind of generic 2D Perlin terrain that I could then use in whatever games or whatever else I wanted to make or look at. Oh yeah, I've also got some like space things going on. I was testing collisions. If you hit these things, then it wakes them up from sleeping. Whereas when I mean sleeping, this first layer of blocks, of little squares that makes up the terrain, are hard, whereas the ones underneath them are purely cosmetic, so they don't actually have any collision detection, any solidity to them. But this top layer is what's called static, so they're never going to, say, wake up or be able to be moved around the screen, whereas these things up here, these space, I call them like digiballs because they're kind of digital in the sense of being binary, like awake or sleeping. I've also got some little AI friends helping me out. Right, so what I wanted to do is, as I go along this terrain, in either direction, be able to come across, say, trees or objects, things like that. So, it's going to have to do. So, what I'm going to aim to do in this video in 19 minutes 45 seconds is get some objects being placed along the terrain, and overcome any issues, and just show you the live debugging to that. So I'll just describe basically what's involved and then get to it. I will say ahead of time I've tried out the earliest stages, so at least we've got something to work with. And oh yeah, and then just to reiterate, this is kind of just a private thing, but I'm just recording it. So if I don't know if it'll be useful to you, but if you like just generally programming, debugging, and things, coding, if you like coding, then this might be for you. Okay, so first thing I've just got to go through is how, let's just sit in this water, how the terrain is working. So what I do is not compute an infinite terrain because this computer doesn't have enough memory to do that. And because this is just JavaScript running in a browser, I'm not using WebGL or anything like that. I'm using a physics engine by Liam Brumit, I think his real name is. His library is called matter.js. I'm using that. I'm using P5 library, using the wonderful tutorials by Daniel Schiffman to help me out. And so, right, so what I do is compute just the terrain kind of stalks. That's what I call each, say, column that makes up the terrain. I call those like ground stalks or G stalks, if you see that term in there when we go into the programming. And basically, when we track the movement of the main player, then we know that we've got to shift some terrain stalks, ground stalks from over here, put them over there off screen so we don't see any magic happening, and then just keep doing that. Did that make sense? So when I move to the right, it's taking which way are you looking? It's taking terrain stalks away from this left-hand side of the screen, and it's placing them smoothly, silkily, sneakily on the other side, and then vice versa if I go to the left. So there are only, I don't know, here about 30, something like that, 30 stalks. So what I want to do is when we move to the right or to the left, off screen I want to say, or rather when we place a new stalk, we want to decide, maybe depending on how high that column, that stalk is, and some other variable, maybe some randomness, maybe something to do with the Perlin noise, so that the object will always be placed in that position. If we start with a seed, that will make sense if you've looked at Perlin noise or know anything about seeds in Minecraft. It's basically, I put in a seed at the beginning, and then if I'm using Perlin noise to decide a terrain attribute, then that object will always be there in the same place whenever we run it, if we started with the same seed, as opposed to random, which every time we run the game, we'll get a new object, placed in different positions. So let's get something working. In fact, this is something that I've done ahead of time. So I just commented it out. So let's uncomment that and then talk you through this. So what I'm saying is, if this my body bod position y, so that is a terrain stalk's position. So I'm saying if my position is less than height times 3, so that's just like a height. If I'm saying if I'm very high, so if this ground stalk is very high, then do this. And all this does is place a new object, a circle object. That's all it does. I've written a wrapper class for Liam Brumit's matter.js so that I can just say this, and what I get, actually there are 3 statements here. There is place a new object, and it's going to be size 12. These parameters just determine, there's only 2 parameters here, they just determine, or arguments rather, the position of the new object, and I'm just going to place it above the stalk, so exactly where the stalk is in terms of its x position, and then the y position of the stalk minus a certain amount, so we get the object placed upon the terrain. And then this circle object is going to be 12 in radius or diameter, I can't remember. Then I say the last object created, i.e. this circle, I want its OSR to be false. That's just something I've made up, means off-screen remove. So if you're dealing with a physics engine, if you're having loads of objects being created and then they're just falling off the screen and then just falling through infinite computer space, then you want to delete those if you're never going to see them again, because it'll take up a lot of the processing power and memory of the computer. So if you want them to stay, like if it's an object like a tree and you want to revisit it, then maybe you want it to, if it's off the screen, to stay there. So I've switched off-screen remove to be false. Now, it's important to be false here because I don't want those objects to just appear on the screen, because that doesn't look very realistic, or I'm not really going for realism in this game, but or simulation, but it just looks contrived. whereas you want to create at least the illusion that you're arriving at a different place and pre-existing objects. So if we're creating them off screen, we don't want them removed if they're checked with this little mechanism. Okay, and then finally we want to make the object sleep. That just means, as with those little digi spaceballs that I showed you, it's going to be static until you bump into it or affect it in a different way. So in fact I'll comment that out, and then we'll have just objects that bounce around. Okay, so if we run again, we should now have yes, little balls being created as we move along the train. By the way, you may have seen like a volcano here. That wasn't created by the code I just uncommented. That was pre-existing. That's just something I've got there going on. Anyway, all I'm doing is creating little blocks and then spewing them up, giving them like a force, a random x force and the same y force, and it runs for a certain amount of time and then stops. Okay. So if the terrain is a certain height, you can't see, I'm pointing with my finger and you can't see it. If the terrain is a certain height, then it will create those balls. So there we go, 2 up here. You'll notice they were created on the peak. Oh, I thought we'd have some more here. Ah, here we go. So this peak is high enough to have these balls being created. Okay, if I go back in this other direction now, I get some more balls created. So the other balls presumably fall through the terrain. If I'm quick enough, I might be able to see them. Yes, so I'm doubling up balls here. So I've got a little problem. This takes place, this creating a new object, in the move me function, which belongs to the gstalk class, I believe. Here we are, gstalk, so a ground terrain, ground column thing. So every time that I want to move it, so if I'm moving my player from left or going right, and I need a new stalk, then I'll call this move me function that then calculates the Perlin noise depending on the stalk's position. I call the position x offset. X offset, that just means the position of this gstalk, which will be important. Okay, so after I've placed it, so I'm still within the function, the move me function. The last thing I'll do then is say, if my position is high enough, then place one of these circles and do what I want to these circles. The problem was that if I go, if my little bubble boo, here he is, if my little bubble boo goes over here and then comes back again, then I'm creating new objects on top of one another. So what I want to do is have some kind of like abstract structure or a number of like slots that record whether we've put in an object for that particular gstalk. So in other words, we're talking about an array, just a one-dimensional array, where we can simply say it's 0 or 1 or false or true, depending on whether we've placed an object there before. So I've already done that, I believe. So at the top, I'm going to make an array called object slots. So I can just keep adding these. Every time we have a new stalk or a new x offset position, then I can decide whether I want to place an object there. When I've placed an object, I must make that object slot true or filled or whatever. So the difficulty will be is recording or knowing what index in this array to refer to. Did 11 minutes just disappear? Last time I looked at the time, it was 11 minutes. So I must have been speaking for about 20 minutes. Or was that one? Oh, does it now say 1 minute? What's going on? I'm really confused. That one timer just... What did I manage to reset it or something? Anyway, 8 minutes left. I'll just read this again. Read my comments up here to myself. So I wrote some pseudocode before... Oh, where's it gone? It's down there. Right. I wrote some pseudocode, and it might explain things better than I did before. So array of object slots. Primary function of these slots is to record whether an object has been placed. So any kind of object. At the moment I'm making these circles. Therewith permitting or denying the placement of an object on request. See place object. Now that I've read that out, that didn't make any better sense. Anyway, our key issue is to record, to know what index in this array to use. And so I've already got this working. So what I did was just talk about, or just use the index, the x offset as the index. Here we go. So let x offset. I've just made this kind of global to this function. Before it was a local function defined in here. You didn't need to know that. But what I can do is, instead of doing all of this here, instead of placing the object there, we can, now that it's getting sufficiently complicated, we should create a new function to do this one job, which I've already done. So I call it place object, and what I pass into there as an argument is the x offset. So that's the position, the exact position of this G stalk. So the first thing I do is make sure that that index isn't a floating point number. Make sure it's an integer. So I just use math floor. You could use math round, but I believe I have a suspicion that would run into some kind of overlapping bug. You might get, i.e., two stalks being rounded, like one being rounded up, one being rounded down to the same slot with some issues. We could try that out for some interesting effects. Anyway, I just use floor to be nice and safe. So first, see if slot is empty. So if we've got an empty slot, then we know we can place an object. An object hasn't been placed there before. So if it's null, because I haven't populated this array, so it must be null, must be empty. And then I do the same as I did before, which is here. So if the stalk is high enough, then place a circle. That's it. And I quite like it when they don't sleep. That's kind of cool when they bounce around. Then what I really should have done inside there is say that I have placed a slot and I've just set it equals 1. It could say true. Anything that's not null. There we go. Declare this slot as filled. Now, when we go, actually, I'll make them sleep because then they won't fall through the terrain and we can see if they're doubling up. Now when we go through, go along the terrain, 1, they should be sleeping, which is good. But 2, and most importantly, when we go back in the other direction, they shouldn't be overlapping. There should just be a single line of balls, which there are, a single line of objects. And we just test that again by going back again. Very good. So we're not doubling up anything. If we now just take off this check, I think it's there. Now we should see them doubling up if I've commented out the right position. Okay, so it's creating them in exactly the fashion as before. And if we go back, Aha, now we're getting them. The object's doubled up and tripled up perhaps if we go back the other way. There we go. So objects are being placed on top of objects, on top of objects, on top of objects. So this check did exactly what we wanted it to accomplish. So we've got a simple solution. So that might be helpful if you're generating like an infinite terrain or something, and then you're placing objects, and then revisiting old places, and you don't want to replicate the placing of an object. Then one simple way to do it is to have an array of slots that just does this job. An alternative solution might be to have a component of belonging to the whatever object constitutes your terrain tile. For me, it's that G-stalk. But it really depends, I suppose, when you're wanting those objects to appear. So I've got 2 minutes left. What I need to kind of accomplish is deal with is not placing an object every single time this happens. So let's just try that now. We'll just put an extra argument in here. We could say and so the G-stalk is high enough, and if we say frame count, I think that's a P5 function. Or do you just put frame count? Frame count modulo 2 is 0. So hopefully there'll be, or to try modulo 5. So you space them out by 5. No, that's stupid. I've just it has spaced them out, but I'm doing it according bizarrely to time frame count instead of G-stalk. So I'll put an ID. ID just means the floored X offset. Okay. So instead of doing it like every 5 milliseconds or whatever I was doing, every 5 frames, now it'll place them every 5 slots. So I think I've only hit 2 slots so far. Okay, this definitely seems like we're high enough, and I'm not hitting any. Let's go backwards. My alarm's just gone off again. So I think this time I need to stop. So there we go. You saw some programming. You've seen me now create a problem. I've done something wrong with my my modulus calculation. You know what? I'll end this video with a tiny bit of debugging. Let's see. I'm gonna or sneeze. Sneeze. Excuse me. Sorry about that. If frame count divided by ID is in scope. Oh my god. I'm determined to use frame count. If ID modulo 5, there we go. Okay, let's just see if that solved it. Sorry. There we go. So every 5 stalks we'll get an object instead of every single one. So as long as there isn't an object already there, which is kind of cool. So these objects could be features of the terrain. It could be enemies like this little fellow, etc., etc. This fellow, by the way, I call him a Blinky. He can carry me on his head. What happens if I put my bubbles on? There we go. Do you like those? A problem is, of course, if I go over here, there isn't any terrain around that Blinky, so he can get stuck if I find him again quickly enough. If I can switch off these bubbles, he might be trapped underneath the terrain. So I was lucky that he wasn't there, but there isn't any terrain where he is. So if I were then to go low, which I'm not doing, the terrain's kind of high. There we go. If I go very, very low, then he's going to try to find me without any terrain in the way. So if I this time go quickly enough to find him again, he should be underground, but I'm going quite high, so I might be lifting him up. And of course, all the objects that I had placed have fallen. So I don't know where my Blinky is. He might be under the terrain somewhere. But yes, a problem related to that is if an object is not sleeping, i.e. is awake, is falling around according to the physics, and you take away the terrain invisibly off screen, then they're going to carry on and fall through. So basically you want to say, if we're off screen, then make it static, so that we don't fall down. It might be slightly different if you've got a mobile creature, some AI, a non-player, what do you call those, non-player entity or something, then non-player creature, then character, then you might want it to lift up a certain height, something like this, or have its own check of the terrain, something like that. So I'm just sorry, I think off the top of my head. Anyway, I've got to stop. We saw some programming. There we go. I hope that was useful. If anyone, I've got snot on my face. Sorry. If anyone comments or wants me to do another one, wants to see how this little private project continues, let me know and I will do. Otherwise, I won't, because it will be wasting your time. There we go. Thank you very much. Happy New Year.